Thank you. Thanks so much for taking time to be here. My name is Craig Wansink. Kelly Jackson and I direct the Robert Nusbaum Center. And again, thanks for taking time out of your schedule. I'm not going to have a long introduction at all. Scott Moore is here, and we're just really happy about that. So thank you so much for being here. He's Associate Professor of History, Assistant Department Chair at Eastern Connecticut State University. His focus in history, he earned his Ph.D. in modern European history. And so this is a little shift, and I'm sure he'll explain why. He's from this area. Welcome home. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, thank you for that introduction. Can everybody hear me? No? I'll lean in. Okay. Now? We're good? Okay. First, before I get started, I just want to thank Craig and also Kelly Jackson and everyone else at the Nusbaum Center for helping make this event possible. I actually have the easy part, which is just talking. They have the hard part of actually coordinating everything, which is a lot of work, so thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge the vital support that I have from my university to help fund all of my research. What you're about to hear today is the byproduct of research grants, travel fund grants, a sabbatical, release time from courses, a whole bunch of things that wouldn't be possible. So I'd like to thank them. I'm also incredibly indebted, especially for this project, to all of the amazing librarians and archivists, particularly those located in this area. Every historian will tell you that our work is impossible without librarians and archivists to point out everything we're missing and to show us where things are hidden. And in particular, given the campus we're on today, I'd like to extend my deepest gratitude to Dr. Stephen Mansfield, who is your longtime university archivist and worked in the library, the history department. He was very gracious in helping me find pictures and other documents that are housed within your own university archives, and you'll see some of them today. If you haven't had a chance to use those records and archives, I suggest doing it. They're such a fantastic resource. I'd also like to thank all of you for taking time out of your day to be here. One of the reasons I love spending my life at a university is because of the community like this that it creates, a community of interest, of intellectual curiosity. And if you'll allow a little bit of autobiographical detail, as Craig mentioned, I grew up in the area, and when I was in middle school and high school, I attended more events on the Wesleyan campus than I can remember, especially during the summer. And so it's really, really great to be back. And so I thank you for having me here. So today I'd like to discuss the cultural legacy of Grace Sherwood, colloquially known locally as the Witch of Pungo. For those of you that have never run across her story, she was a farmer's wife who lived near modern-day Muddy Creek Road. So hop on Princess Anne Road, keep on it as it keeps changing its name a few times, and then drive straight to Muddy Creek Road in Pungo, and that's where she lived. And she was accused by her neighbors of being a witch in 1706. These accusations not only culminated in a formal witch trial, which was actually very rare in Virginia. Even though witch belief was not rare, formal trials for witchcraft were. And not only that, but she also was ducked, or she endured what's known as a trial by water, which means that she was essentially bound in some way and put into running water, in this case, the Lynnhaven River, because the belief was that evil would be repelled by a pure element like water. And so if she floated unnaturally, that meant that she was tainted by Satan's magic. And because of this event, the area has been known as Witch Duck ever since, and her story has left an indelible impact on this area. It is a foundational piece of local folklore. And so today I'd like to talk a little bit about that. And it's actually this connection of local folklore that got me from being a modern European historian to writing a book about colonial witchcraft. As a historian, even though I study the past, what I'm really interested in is historical memory, which means how do communities remember their past? So not so much what happened, but more of what do we think happened, or how do we interpret what happened? How do we tell the stories of what happened? And when you do that, if you use those stories and study them, you can learn a lot about modern societies. You can learn a lot about the communities that tell those stories. And so as interesting as Grace Sherwood's story is in and of itself, what drew me to work on this project is the impact it has had on this area. right? And I'm just going to give you in like 30 seconds a little snippet. If you just drive a little bit down Witch Duck Road, all the ways you're going to just literally tumble across her, right? So you have Witch Duck Point neighborhood. You have roads like Sherwood Lane on Witch Duck Road. If you were to go near Bayside Hospital, you'll see a statue dedicated to Grace Sherwood, along with a roadside sign discussing her testing. Across the street at Old Donation Church, you have a little marker that commemorates her ducking there. And all of these things, I think, are just the most modern and physical manifestation of this influence. At any given point over the last 200 years, her story's been sketched, sculpted, embroidered in quilts. If you were to go to the Pungo Blackwater Library, you can see a quilt that has her story on it. For about 30 years, the Strawberry Festival in Pungo crowned an honorary Witch of Pungo. Here you can see the one from 1984. More on the eggshell later. Some of you, if you're over 21, might be indulging in the Witch of Pungo pumpkin ale that is released this time each year by a local brewery. If you happen to have been a high school student or middle school student in the 90s, you probably saw Irene Hale in local history museums reenacting herself as Grace Sherwood giving various events. If you drive about 45 minutes up the road to Colonial Williamsburg, you can attend Cry Witch, which is one of their longest running and most popular trial programs that reenacts the theoretical trial of Grace Sherwood. It's a really fun way to spend a night if you ever get a chance. And if you get there early enough, you can be one of the people that sits at the dais next to the guy playing the governor of Virginia. So incentive to stand in line early. And so all of this shows, again, that this story has left a deep imprint on this area. And in a certain sense, I think it is an ideal story for this sort of cultural imprint, because in reality, we don't actually know a lot about Grace Sherwood or her trial, which means there are not inconvenient facts that can get in the way for the way we choose to interpret them, right? It's very much a blank canvas. So you're going to get a very short overview of what we know definitively about her before I look at how we have metabolized that story and how we've told that story. In order to understand the past, historians rely on an intersection of written records, and in older periods, we rely on things like archaeological evidence. Both of these things are very scant for the earliest Virginia communities. First off, I don't know if you've ever been here in the summer, but it's really humid. And so any archaeological artifacts have decayed and fallen apart from this period for the most part. Written records also are not particularly numerous. Really, all we have from this early time are court records. This is not a time where early Virginians wrote diaries or wrote letters to people they may have known in other places. And so we actually have nothing that Grace Sherwood ever said, for the most part. Like maybe one or two lines recorded in a court transcript, but we don't have anything in her voice, which means her story has always been mediated through the voice of other people, even during her own time, because we have somebody transcribing what they observed. And even these transcriptions aren't particularly evocative. They don't have a lot of information. So if you compare this to, let's say, records that are left behind by Virginia's Eastern Shore counties, where the clerk would give detailed transcripts of testimony that people said, the Princess Anne County clerk was a little sparser, right? He didn't give a lot of information. And so there's a lot of blank spaces. All we can say for certain is that Grace Sherwood was a farmer's wife who grew up, as I mentioned, near Muddy Creek Road. And so basically about here, we don't know exactly for sure. If you were to look at the balloon, the sort of blowout of the map, this is the more populous area of Princess Anne County at the time. It's where the courthouse and church would have been. And so very remote. We know that she was not particularly popular among her neighbors. At some point in 1698, she sued 3 of her neighbors for slander, meaning they were defaming her character and her perspective. This was not unique. Virginians sued each other all the time. It was a way of defending their reputations against slights that might endanger their standing in the community. We know 2 of these suits were explicitly connected to allegations of witchcraft, that neighbors were telling people she was a witch. If you want the sort of fun details, these are actually the ones that give us the most understanding of what people were saying about her. And so one very generically just accused Grace Sherwood of cursing their crops and their livestock. Another neighbor had a more fantastical story of Grace Sherwood riding her like a horse at night and then transforming into a cat and leaving. As fun as that is, it is shockingly typical for witchcraft allegations of this time. Both of those things were really, really common. By 1705 and 1706, she began to actually be formally accused of witchcraft, and this resulted in a formal trial. We have some records of this trial, but we don't actually know what she was accused of doing with witchcraft. It just says that she bewitched one of her neighbors, according to the allegation, and that's all we have. And that could mean anything from I have had bad luck ever since Grace Sherwood talked to me funny to I almost died because of a sudden illness that I think she caused. There is a range of things that people could have done with witchcraft. This trial, as I've just mentioned, resulted in her ducking or her trial by water. And I think the most frustrating part, if you're interested in knowing the whole story, is we have no idea what the result of this trial is. We know she failed her trial by water, but we don't know what eventually happened afterward. The trial records ominously conclude with that she's to be held to await future trial, and there are no future or other records related to anything else. And so there's a giant question mark as to what happens next to this story. All we know is that she survived long enough to die in 1740 around the age of 80, right? So she's eventually back on her farm. So there's a lot of blank spaces. But one thing that's very clear is this name witch duck. Her ducking was such a strange event in the contours of most people's lives. She's the only Virginian we know that endured a trial by water for witchcraft, that it left an immediate impact on the area. We have records going back to at earliest in the 19th century calling it witch's duck, and the odds are that's probably generations earlier. And so if you'll ride with me on sort of a thought experiment, imagine you have a really strange name, right? Oh, that's near witch's duck. Well, by this point, nobody's been alive that remembered those events. You also don't have ready access to the small handful of records that still exist. And so how do you compensate for that? You tell stories, right? Folklorists, sociologists, anthropologists, pick your field that studies people, have always noticed if something has a weird name or a weird look or something strange about it, local folklore is going to develop about it. And so what begins to happen, and I'll use the words of Nathaniel Hawthorne from The House of the Seven Gables, is that strange tales are sure to spring up for ages afterwards, like the toadstools that indicate where the fallen and buried trunk of a tree has long since moldered into the earth. They are tradition, which sometimes brings down truth that history has let slip, but oftener is the wild babble of the time, such as was formerly spoken at the fireside and now congeals in newspapers. He's much more eloquent than I am. That's why I let him say that. And so, like Hawthorne's metaphorical toadstools, stories about Grace Sherwood developed to answer the questions people had about witch's duck. Who was duck there? Why was she ducked? What was she like? What were her neighbors like? And these stories fill in those gaps and those sinews. And they spread by word of mouth, they change over time. And we get a sense, and I'll explain how we get a sense of this. We have a sense of what some of these stories were based on recorded versions that still exist. Now, I am the first to acknowledge this is imperfect. In an ideal world, somebody with a pen and paper trained in folklore research would have been going through communities in Witch Duck and in Pungo, writing down verbatim exactly what people were saying, but nobody did that. So instead, what happens is these folk tales fuse with the written word and written discussions of Grace Sherwood's trial, and that's how we can sort of pull out little teases of how this story evolves over time. Make sense? So these are what kept Grace Sherwood literally alive, metaphorically, in the community, these stories. Otherwise, she would have fallen into the wayside like every other accused Virginia witch. In fact, if we had more time, I could throw out names like Joan Wright or William Harding or Alice Cartwright. Names none of you probably know unless you really dive into this issue, but all of whom actually were accused of witchcraft in Virginia. But Grace Sherwood was unique because of this impact. So unique that once historians began trying to preserve records, it made her case pop out when they started collecting those records. In 1833, the Virginia Historical Society, which just started its work and began publishing records, with much fanfare, published the first known transcripts of Grace Sherwood's trial and ducking. These were hand transcribed by John Burroughs, who was the longtime county clerk for Princess Anne County Courts. And so he was doing meticulous work that I am eternally grateful for, where he took all of these old records from the 1600s and hand wrote them out again to make sure they survived. It also is much easier to read because he had beautiful handwriting. And so if you go to Virginia Beach's Central Library, they're actually in an end cap. You can go, you don't need special permission, just go and look at them. And they are in this beautiful copperplate 19th century secretarial hand. And then you go to the next volume that he didn't transcribe and you can barely read them. And so it made my life a lot easier. But he was interested in preserving local history. And one of the things he did as he transcribed was take out these accounts of Grace Sherwood's trial and then put them together and got them to the Virginia Historical Society, who then published them because we have records of witchcraft outside of New England now, right? And it was treated as this strange curiosity, a Virginia witch. And so Grace Sherwood was the only Virginia witch for the entire 19th century because she's the only one people knew about. The records themselves are really sparse. He literally only pulls out this stuff related to her ducking. We know nothing about her socioeconomic condition, who accused her, any of the background of her other cases, because he just pulled about 5 or 6 pages, right? It'll be another 50 years before another researcher compiles all the records you can uncover about Grace Sherwood. He ignores everything else about her accusers and all of that, but he collects her will, her records related to land transactions, her previous lawsuits, and these are all published in the William and Mary Quarterly, and also the Lower Norfolk, or a journal that transcribed Lower Norfolk's county records. And so these were the most complete records that we had through that period, unless you actually crawled into the old documents. But these are what most people went to, right? And so for over 100 years, these two collections are what everybody read to find out the true story. However, if you think back to what I just said about 10 minutes ago, that story leaves a lot of empty spaces, right? And so imagine you're a magazine editor, back when magazines used to be read by people, and you're trying to make an interesting story, right? We have the Virginia witch. Well, is it a good story if you don't literally know anything about the witch other than how much money she made and a handful of details? There's a lot of blank spaces. So what people began to do is merge in these tales that people had been telling locally, right? So you mix legend and history together in a way that makes them almost inseparable, because it's not like the authors interrupt their story to say, and according to locals. No, you just blend it together and it creates this fusioned legend, right? And I'll give you an early example of it from 1884, probably one of the most famous narrative forms of Grace Sherwood's trial, meaning it made a story out of it, was written by a novelist named John Easton Cook, who wrote lots of sort of pulpy melodramas for local magazines and national magazines. And so for Harper's Magazine, he wrote the story of Grace Sherwood called The One Virginia Witch. And I'm just going to give you an excerpt to show this blending of history and reality, or history and legend. The result of this harmless fancy, which is that Grace Sherwood sailed in an eggshell. So he tells the first story of her sailing in an eggshell to bring back rosemary to the area. The harmless result of this fancy was that Princess Anne was soon covered with rosemary. But the neighbors of young Grace Sherwood were ungrateful. For want of something better to occupy their minds, they began to gossip about her. Rosemary was sweet, but there was that voyage in the eggshell boat. It was true it harmed nobody, but such proceedings were uncanny. Only witches who rode on broomsticks to midnight meetings could sail in eggshells. And as witches cast spells and exert malignant influences on honest people, it was plain that Grace Sherwood was a witch and ought to be tried and punished. So he's trying to explain, why did she get accused? And then he adds in this story of her sailing in an eggshell. Also, this will be important a little bit later on. Notice he gives us a little information about Grace Sherwood. She's described as young. Grace Sherwood was in her late 30s, early 40s, hardly young in the context of modern, or of colonial Virginia society. Modern day, yes, that's true. To show you how long this sort of blending occurred, here's an excerpt or a snippet from the Virginian Pilot in 1920. that similarly recounts the story of Grace Sherwood. And notice the headline, Grace Sherwood, Virginia's witch, convicted by a jury of women and drowned in the Lynnhaven River. She didn't drown. Strange tale of 1706 recorded at Princess Anne, and then notice below it, young woman charged with crossing ocean at night in eggshell craft. Right? And if you actually take the time to zoom in the blurry bits, you'll notice the author keeps saying, a perusal of the records will prove, as records will demonstrate. And it's all of these details that are not in the records. So how did he hear them? He went down over to Witch Duck and was talking to people about what they said was in the records, and then he wrote it down as if it was fact, right? So you have this sort of blending again of fact and legend. And so you can see sort of from a literary standpoint how this happens. And it also, I think, shows that the area is fascinated by her story, right? Why would the pilot publish this article? Well, because there was a deep interest in understanding that story. And so because of this, studying her story and studying the way that story has changed over time is really the story of Princess Anne County, now Virginia Beach, right? You can see how this community tells its tales and how the community changed. And because of this, the storytellers are equally as important to this story. And so I'm going to give you little snippets of biography about a lot of these people. One of the things for people that have studied historical memory, but also performance storytelling, will always communicate stories are never static. Even stories we think of as static, like Little Red Riding Hood, Snow White, they're not static. They change and evolve over time. And there's an enormous power storytellers have in shaping those stories, right? So anytime you go to an event where somebody's telling you a story, you're participating in it, the storyteller's participating in it, and the community participates in it, right? And so these storytellers are essential to the story. The first I want to mention is a Presbyterian minister of Knox Presbyterian over in Norfolk, W.H.T. Squires, who is also a local amateur historian, who famously published a work in 1928 called The Days of Yesteryear. And so it's this quaint little book of just Virginia history. And it's little vignettes of Virginia's past. And he has an entire chapter on Grace Sherwood, and he talks about the history of the trial, but then most importantly, records an entire series of tales that he attributes to the Witch Duck area. Unfortunately, he doesn't say who he was talking to, so we don't know how much of it's him writing the story and how much of it's him recording what he heard. But according to his writing, he heard everything that he's recording from folks in Witch Duck. And he was really the first to put to paper these legends in their own right, as opposed to blending them. He also gave, by my count, over 3 or 4 dozen lectures over his decade career as a public speaker, where he constantly talked about Grace Sherwood. So he was really important for sharing this story. Around the same time that he was writing, there was another figure named Benjamin Dye White, who was the circuit court judge for Princess Anne County. One of the most important families of the area. If you drive down Great Neck Road, you'll come by John B. Dye High School, right? So he's part of that family. Benjamin Dye White was committed to the preservation of local history. He was instrumental in saving Old Nation Church, which is near Witch Duck Road. And he just had a deep, passionate commitment to saving the history of this area. And he had a profound interest in Grace Sherwood. In fact, he wrote a little pamphlet called Gleanings from the History of Princess Anne County. It's about 19 pages. Almost a third of it's dedicated purely to Grace Sherwood. So this is what he considers one of the most important stories. Here you can see a picture of his wife, Elizabeth, drawn from your very own university library, so thank you. And you'll notice she's standing in front of a fence, and this fence came, according to legend, from the farm of Grace Sherwood. So near Muddy Creek Road, where people said Grace Sherwood lived, there was this little cypress wood fence. Benjamin Dye White heard the farmer was about to take it down and worried they were about to tear down Grace Sherwood's fence. He literally raced down to where it was, took a segment of it, relocated it back to his house near the Witch Duck area, and then used it to grow roses on for the next 40 years. And he was a very public figure, and so people would come to his house for home and garden tours, and literally for the next 30 years, he, then later his wife after he died, would tell stories about Grace Sherwood in front of her fence. He also had a gavel carved from a walnut stump taken from the same farm and gave it to the Norfolk Bar Association. I was actually contacted from them recently, and they're very sad they can't find it. But nevertheless, they have the minutes where he gave it to them. And as we think about why her story for folks like Benjamin Dye White, who has no connection to it, or W.H.T. Squires, who had no immediate connection to it, right? Neither of them even lived close to Pungo. I think I'll use W.H.T. Squires' own words to help explain why they thought it was so important. In the days of yesteryear, his book, W.H.T. Squires says, each generation has repeated the quaint folk stories which have gathered around her, Grace Sherwood's name. On long summer afternoons, the grandmothers gather their little ones about their knees and tell again and again the stories of Grace, her magic, her power, her fate. So in other words, these stories matter not because of Grace Sherwood, but because of the generations that have told that story. And so if we think about those stories, what they do is they build a community. And historical legends have always served this purpose. They simplify the past and turn it into a story that provides a shared sense of self that transcends individual differences, the gaps that separate generations, and they're an invisible thread that connect those who live with those who came before them. And as we see from the efforts of W.H.T. Squires and Benjamin Dye White, that they see it as important to make sure they survive to be passed on to the people who come after them. And I would argue that this became even more essential in the 1950s as the area began to dramatically change. To give you a sense of how dizzying the transformation of Princess Anne County to Virginia Beach was, in 1963, you have a doubling of the population from 111,400 people to 295,700 people by the 80s. So within a 20-year period, the population more than doubles. The population by 2010 was 437,000, and it's probably higher than that today. And so what this means is within the lifetime of most residents, not only did the area double, triple, quadruple in size, but also what had been family farms are now new neighborhoods with people who are new to the area. And this is dizzying for people that are watching their homes change, but also people who are now moving to the area, who want to feel connected to the area, to the places that they live. And Grace Sherwood now provides this connection to what seemingly was lost, and also help to make people moving to the area feel more connected to their new home, right? And so these stories are really important. And this is certainly the interest of a longtime journalist, George H. Tucker, who some of you may remember, longtime columnist for the Virginian Pilot, who recounted various Grace Sherwood stories over 24 times over his multi-decade career. He also recorded them in a collection of Virginia folk tales. And for Tucker, he was always explicit that these are the area's stories, right? The reason they're important to know is because they communicate who we are. And he was always fantastical in his stories. He had a fondness for not just her sailing in eggshells, but also, as you can see from his illustration, the legend that she would take pewter plates and put them under her arms and then fly away, right? These are all fantastical. Nobody is telling this as a true story. And in fact, George Tucker would often say that there are two Grace Sherwoods. There's the woman who actually lived, and then there's the woman from these folk tales and these stories, right? The woman that's a fantastical witch doing all these magical things, and then the real woman who actually endured the torment and scorn of her community. As much as I accept his truth to that, I would add a third one. There's a third Grace Sherwood that I think has become increasingly important in previous decades, and that is an equally legendary Grace Sherwood, but one that is providing a supposedly true story of what happened. In other words, we're shortening away sailing in eggshells and putting plates under our arms and flying. And instead, it's a biographical story that tries to fill in those missing gaps. What was Grace Sherwood accused of doing? What was she like as a person? Why didn't people like her? What happened to her after her trial? And so all of these things are rooted in reality, but yet they're drawn, again, from cultural tradition, right? And you can see this evolution. So I'll use Rip Rylance's sort of sketch of Grace Sherwood as we have that conversation. We see this evolution over time, and I'm going to give you a brief overview of this evolution. The most consistent piece of what I think we could call truthy lore about Grace Sherwood is that she was unconventionally beautiful. We have evidence of this going back all the way to the dawn of the 20th century, that people rumored that she was so beautiful it disrupted her community. And that is the most consistent piece of local lore about the so-called real Grace Sherwood that we have. if you were to look, I think you can clearly see that for the most part, depictions of Grace Sherwood reflect the times in which they were told. They reflect the attitudes that time had about women, the status of women. And so if you read, for example, John Easton Cook's One Virginia Witch, Grace Sherwood is this young, beautiful, meek, demure, quiet woman who is put upon and exploited by powerful, grotesque men that are around her. In fact, he's borrowing essentially from Gothic tropes. If you ever read any Gothic novel, I've just described the plot of a Gothic novel to you for the most part. And she stays this meek, quiet, demure woman for about 50, 60 years. This is who pops up in John Easton, or not just in John Easton Cook's book, but W.H.T. Squires as well. You can see it persist into the 1930s when Beverly Campbell wrote a summary of her trial for the Richmond Times-Dispatch. Here's the illustration from it. Grace Sherwood's so meek that Beverly Campbell even totally invents a fabricated lawyer for her named Mr. Peyton, who intervenes on her behalf as the decisive male figure to save this poor, quiet woman from the exploitation around her. And so here she's this sort of quiet woman. If you know any of the local stories people are telling now about Grace Sherwood, nobody ever accuses her of being quiet. Right? And this changes primarily by the middle of the 20th century. And the person most responsible for this change, and at least getting it rooted in our cultural memory, is a force of nature in her own right, Louisa Venable Kyle, who was a longtime philanthropist, journalist, writer, public speaker, preserver of local culture, who very famously wrote a children's book, The Witch of Pungo, that collected early stories about Virginia's past. And it very famously has a chapter on Grace Sherwood, and in it, she has a section on the history of the event. And in that, she begins describing the real Grace Sherwood. And Louisa Venable Kyle, over the decades that she was active in the community, would give interviews constantly to people to talk about Grace Sherwood. And now, again, we'll use her own words. Kyle said that Sherwood was, quote, an attractive, independent, strong-willed woman who was a nonconformist by nature. She loved fame and public notice and took every opportunity to do shocking things to amuse or upset her more sedate neighbors. She was also beautiful and enchanting, which lured away the husbands and lovers of the other women in her community, and, quote, this brought about her downfall. And talking with a local archaeologist, she said, in another time or place, Grace Sherwood might have been a great actress or a social lioness or a great leader of women's causes. And this isn't an offhanded remark. This is literally how Louisa Venable Kyle presented Grace Sherwood. And I think the most lasting impact beyond this image is on Grace Sherwood herself, because Louisa Venable Kyle said she scandalized her neighbors by wearing men's clothing, especially pants. And the argument was that she found her husband's clothing more form-fitting, but also less cumbersome and easier to work with, and this scandalized her community and had her labeled as a witch. And so I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, well, why do you think by 1973, Grace Sherwood is a strong, independent, active woman who's a nonconformist who wears pants? And if anybody knows anything about American history, what is going on with the women's liberation movement and second wave feminism? She is literally defining sort of the modern sort of women's rights movement. I personally never met Louisa Venable Kyle. She died in 1999. Here you can see her presenting all of her books to one of your former presidents. I can't help but think that Louisa Venable Kyle was talking a little bit about herself when she talked about Grace Sherwood. In other words, if you think about her starting a very active career in public leadership and journalism in the 1950s, she had to have felt a certain chafe from people who limited her progress in the community, right? Louisa Venable Kyle, as I mentioned, died in 1999 as a fierce matron of local tradition. In one of the profiles she gave before her death, she said she moved here because she wanted a home of her own. And that's what made her work to preserve local sites, to preserve local history. And so in her mind, she was literally the protector of this community's traditions. It didn't take long, though, once she died, for another person to become a protector of local traditions, and especially Grace Sherwood. And so we're very much moving into the modern era. This is within the century we're in. The current center of all things Grace Sherwood is Ferry Plantation House, located again a little bit around the corner. It's a historic home that has a long history of being connected to Grace Sherwood, even though it was built over a century after her ducking and death. And that's because it used to be a courthouse. And because it used to be a courthouse, locals said this is where she used to be housed when she was imprisoned, even though she couldn't have been. This house was restored in the 1990s, and it also became a house that hosted innumerable events commemorating Grace Sherwood. For example, for almost a decade, they held a literal reenactment of her ducking. They would incorporate her story into every tour that you would go on in the area. And all of this was almost the single-minded dedication of its longtime director, Belinda Nash. And really, Belinda Nash is the one who has made Grace Sherwood a physical imprint on this area. And we'll sort of talk about that in a second. And as we look at what motivated Belinda Nash, and I'm drawing again from her own words, Belinda Nash was deeply committed to the idea of exonerating Grace Sherwood. The idea was not just to tell stories about her. The idea was to heal the historic injustice she felt had been done to the woman that was still considered a witch by many in her community. And so she was committed to telling, in her mind, the true story so people knew the true woman. And building off of Louisa Venable Kyle's strong, independent, defiant woman, you also will add in details that are very commonly said about her today in the community, such as that she was an herbalist and a midwife, which ran afoul of the local community, or that she was a healer of animals and could take care of the sick. All of these things are missing from the historic record, but actually borrow quite a lot from what people were saying about witches by the time you get to the 2000s. In fact, I'm going to borrow here from a scholar named Diane Purkis, who studies the intersection of the way we tell witch stories, who has noted that by the 1960s, both feminist scholars but also neo-pagan practitioners created an image of accused witches. Sorry about that, to help explain the prevalence of witch trials. And one of the things she will argue is that this modern depiction of a witch is a woman who was surrounded by their gardens where they grew all manner of herbs and healing plants. They lived alone, but had their gardens and their animals for company. They took lovers when they wished. They were always busy. The women were healers and midwives who had practical knowledges taught to them by their mother. Sound familiar? It's very much the story of Grace Sherwood. And if we were to look at why also Belinda Nash was drawn to this story, again, I'm going to use her own words. She said that she felt kinship because she believed that had she been alive in the 18th century, quote, they would have ducked me too. And that was a newspaper article from about 2006. And so if we look, Belinda Nash was a pioneer in getting, for example, Grace Sherwood's plaque on the Virginia Legends Walk on the ocean front. She was one of the driving forces that helped get her, actually she was the driving force that got her exonerated by Virginia's governor in 2006. She is also the person who helped make sure the statue was built, and here you can see her at the dedication. She was a longtime member of Old Donation Church and helped get the stone that was put in on their grounds there. And so here again, we can see this this blend of storyteller and story having this impact. And I think if you want a sort of understanding of the lasting impact of folks like Belinda Nash, but also Louisa Venable Kyle, just simply Google Grace Sherwood and read what's said about her. And it's the story that was perpetuated by these two individuals, or shared and retold and given to the community. And so the influence of Nash, Kyle, George Tucker, W.H.T. Squires on how we tell Grace Sherwood's story is the best illustration of the fact that it really is Virginia Beach's story. It has almost nothing to do with her herself. It's the story of our community. In this sense, it comes a way, and you'll forgive me for continuing to identify with the area, to maintain our identity. It metabolizes our experiences. It makes sense of our place in the world. It helps people see themselves and their struggles and the broader contours of humanity, while also developing stronger connections between their home and their neighbors. And I would argue that's the lasting or the most lasting impact of these historic legends. Thank you for your attention. I think we have like 10 minutes on the dot for questions. And so thank you for your attention. Any questions? Yes.
I actually live near the Bayside Hospital, so I see that statue a lot when I pass by it.
Yep. Do you go there to give her rosemary and other herbs?
No, I've never gone near it.
Yep. Any other questions? Yes.
Well, I have a question for you as a historian.
Yes.
Considering how we as a society are moving into this digital footprint, how do historians feel about the preservation of history going forward? Does that like cause trepidation?
Right. So that's actually a really good question. And to be honest, I am more afraid, for anybody that didn't hear it, was just how historians navigate the movement to a more digital world. I am more afraid for anybody who wants to study this moment in time, because I don't know how we preserve social media posts and things like that. I will say this book would have been impossible without digital humanities. And the reason why is because so many of the examples I found are these little offhand mentions of Grace Sherwood that if I didn't have the ability to draw on digitized books and newspapers, I wouldn't have been able to find them. And so it's opening up avenues we could have never imagined, but also I think there are challenges to make sure, for example, you preserve things in ways that can adapt to technology, right? So that you have file formats that are static and stable, that don't require programs that might disappear. And I hope, and I know there are librarians and archivists that are trying to think through how you save, our digital communications today, because a lot of them are held by folks like Facebook and Instagram and TikTok, and what happens to them when those companies cease to exist or choose not to archive them. There's also privacy issues. So yeah, but luckily for me who studies older stuff, I'm benefiting from all the things that are being digitized. But it's a great question. Yeah.
Could you explain the eggshell thing?
So I can only explain that it's a story people told. And so the story is that Grace Sherwood needed rosemary. Depending on the storyteller, it's to cook, maybe because she likes the smell, she thinks it has magical properties. So she sails to England or the Mediterranean in an eggshell, collects the rosemary, brings it back in a single night, and then that's why we have rosemary in the city. It's a very quaint story. That's one of the oldest that we've told about her. Though, like a lot of stories, it has its antecedents in other spaces. There are plenty of other communities and spaces that tell similar witch tales of
So
witches.
I was wondering if this was
Right.
like the eggshell thing was like in other witch.
Yes, yeah. And also, I mean, there's a really interesting analogous story from Knott's Island in North Carolina about a witch who sailed in a small bark boat to bring back rosemary. And what that tells me is either we got it first or Knott's Island got it first, and then it sort of migrated one way or the other. But obviously, I think the story itself migrated from the UK. Because what happens, and we see this with folks who have studied the transmission of folklore, is that to keep folklore relevant, when it migrates to new communities, you change it to reach the details of your community. Right? And so if you have a story about a witch that you think would be interesting to tell, well, you draw on the local witch in town and you make it about her, right? And that way it has more resonance, it has more rooting. But great question. Yes, sir.
Are these German immigrants? That's the only reference I've ever heard to ducking other than here.
So ducking was actually also really common. It was done a lot in Germany because they had the most witch trials in Europe. But it was a long-standing practice going all the way back to the Middle Ages. And in fact, people used to use it in the Middle Ages for even normal criminal trials, because the idea is that a criminal tainted himself before God and could therefore be rejected by water. But it was most closely associated with witchcraft. I do think it's worth mentioning that as much as we think of it as sort of a test for witchcraft, it was very controversial, because anybody with logic could realize there's lots of ways that whole thing could go wrong, even in the 1600s. And in fact, in English-speaking Europe especially, it was very tainted, because the worst and most infamous witch craze in English history was done by a man named Matthew Hopkins, who was who proclaimed himself Witchfinder General during the English Civil War, and he killed 300 women over his career, and his preferred method for determining their guilt was ducking. And so because he was branded essentially as an infamous outlaw after the English Civil War, that test was tainted, right? And so since we didn't get a lot to talk about her trial, I will mention, not only do I think it's a sign that this court here was desperate to resolve the matter, they were probably hoping she'd sort of sink so they could fish her out of the water and then she'd be fine, and then it would resolve everything. But also, it's, I think, important to note that Princess Anne County passed a law that because at the time, if a woman was accused of a crime or slander or gossip or was seen as problematic in her community, her husband was legally liable for anything she did. So he would be on the hook for paying fines or other things. And so many women were being accused of slandering their neighbors and being taken to court. Princess Anne County and Lower Norfolk County passed a law that allowed husbands to have their wives publicly ducked to shame them instead of paying a fine. And so as I look at this, I think most of the observers would see this as a way of signaling her as a problem within the community and see this as a sort of acknowledgement that she needed to essentially get in line. Yeah. Yes, sir.
How would you compare this to the Salem witch trials and the enormous, comparatively enormous studies that have been done over the past few decades, finding economics or gender to be at the heart of the issue?
So when I worked on with the book I wrote on Grace Sherwood, the first part is all about her trial. And I drew enormously from that work because it showed you how to analyze witch trials well, to understand why they happen, how they happen. And what I would say is that work is just getting started in Virginia trials, because there was, if you look at the work people have done on Grace Sherwood, nobody took the time to really figure out who her accusers were, what their relationship to her was. It all relied on folktales that talked about, a jealous neighbor or this or that. And so I think there's a lot of guidance that the work done in Salem and New England can do for other spaces to understand witch accusations elsewhere, because it is very much an interconnection of ideas about gender, but also community dynamics, social dynamics. Is that also a great question? Yes, sir.
You grew up with this stuff. You grew
Yes.
up knowing about her. What in the world made you think there'd be enough material here to do a book on?
So I'll give the answer every academic will never tell you, and that is blind hope. So you just hope that there's enough there, and then you get really sad when there isn't, and then you think, well, maybe I can write a smaller article. Can this be 20 pages? But to be honest, if you want to know how this happened, what made me decide to make the plunge? First, there was a small event called COVID that prevented me from being able to travel to Europe to do research, and I wanted something to keep me busy. And I came across the social media post commemorating her ducking, and I was just thinking, this is a really, really famous case, and it's really interesting. And no one's ever looked at the cultural history of the trial, right? Nobody's ever looked at that impact that I just described. And so I actually started the book with the second and third sections, which look at the evolution of her folktales and her cultural impact. And then I was like, well, I guess I have to write the history of it, right? And then I got to actually the first question, because my thought is, this is so famous. Everybody's obviously uncovered everything that actually happened in the trial. And then I realized there's actually a lot of work that could be done to contextualize and give nuance and depth to what's going on in the actual history itself. And so the nice thing is that then fleshed out the sort of more complete story. But when I first approached it, I was thinking that would be sort of a few chapters at the beginning, and it became much more important, that history. And that's how I adapted it. Yeah.
I know she's pretty,
Yes.
uncommonly beautiful.
Yes.
And I still want to believe the 1970s version of the story. Do people get angry at you for taking away the stories they know about her?
So I think I've been fortunate that nobody's gotten angry at me, but I will also say I have a deep reverence for the stories because I think they're so important, right? I think the most important takeaway I would give for anybody here is to not be dismissive of historical legend and memory, because they are community history, right? And so my goal is to never myth bust anybody. My goal is, I'll say what we can prove, And, if I can't prove it, I can't say it. But also, I have enormous reverence for this story and the way it's impacted the area. And I think that's how you are able to tell community stories, is by looking at this heritage.
We're so grateful that you joined us. Thank you all for coming today as well. Thank you.
Thank you.